Welcome back to the Ancient Path. Let's take another look at this phrase from the Nicene Creed. I believe in one God, Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. In a previous episode, we talked about how God is omnipresent, how His Spirit is contending with every human being to bring them to loving submission to God. But we also talked about how God has given us free will. Now I want to take a closer look at what it means for God to be omnipotent. Omnipotence means that God has unrivaled power. He has all power and all authority. Notice the Creed proclaims God's omnipotence by calling Him Father Almighty. But there is an obvious and important question that must be asked here. How can God be almighty and yet we have free will? How can God have all the power and yet we have the power of choice? The answer is we have the power of choice or free will because God has freely chosen to empower us with choice. No one forced God to give us power. Remember that God created the world creatio ex nihilo, meaning everything came from nothing. Therefore, any power that we have is power that God has sovereignly chosen to give us. We have the power of limited choice because God has sovereignly chosen to give us that power. However, for God to truly endow us with free choice or free will means that God cannot simply take away our free will anytime we choose to use it against His will. The main reason why our world is so filled with evil is that we continue to choose to use that free will in ways that troubles the heart of God. Consider this. If I gave you $100, what if you chose to use it to buy, say, cigarettes? What could I do? I could contend with you. I could reason with you to attempt to change your free will, but I cannot simply take away the money that I gave you. If I did that, then I never would have really given you the money to begin with. So notice that this power of choice creates moral responsibility. I am now responsible for the choices that I make precisely because I have the power to make those choices. It is important to realize, however, that God gave us power. He gave us this power of choice before the fall. God gave us power when we were capable of doing with it what honors Him, when we were God-centered. But notice in our fallen condition, we choose to do things that grieve the heart of God. We choose to use our free will, as I said earlier, against God's will. We are now self-centered and not God-centered. We are bent towards self and not towards God. So notice the issue that God has to deal with in a fallen world. He has given us power through which we have free choice, but now we are in a spiritually dead condition, which means that we lack the interior framework to make choices that really please God. If God simply takes control and micromanages our decision making, then we really don't have freedom. If He doesn't micromanage us, we could do horrible evil. So how can God help a totally depraved humanity ever choose to do what is right, just, and holy without simply taking away the freedom that He has designed for us to have? The answer is God contends with us. God contends with us, but God does not control us. Hear that. God contends with us, but He does not micromanage and control us. As we said in a previous video, God's prevenient grace contends with every human heart. God's prevenient grace restores the faculties of the human heart so that the heart can respond to God. Remember, when Adam and Eve ate of the fruit, we spiritually died. We were spiritually disconnected from God. natural humanity is still spiritually dead. We will be governed by our souls, our mind, will, and emotions, or our flesh. So prevenient grace enables a spiritually dead man to respond to God. God's prevenient grace makes the ability to choose what pleases God possible. And that is what God was doing with Cain, as we spoke of in a previous video. His spirit was contending with Cain so that Cain would choose to do what pleases God rather than to be the first murderer. Have you ever felt a pang of guilt about doing something, or maybe just a sense that it was not the right thing to do? Often, this is God's Spirit contending with your soul to act in accordance with what is truthful, just, and holy. And God's Spirit is graciously contending with all of humanity. Prevenient grace is irresistible. That means God is pouring out. We cannot stop God from pouring out His prevenient grace. Justifying grace, however, the grace for full surrender and salvation, is resistible. While God empowers us to be able to respond to Him, He does not take the power of choice away from us. So He does not force us to be saved, but He does give us the power to be able, again, to choose His salvation. His grace empowers us to surrender, to choose Him, and walk in His will rather than in our sinful inclinations. Finally, God's omnipotence, His being all-powerful, means that final judgment belongs to God. We will talk more about the final judgment in a subsequent video, but what's important for the purposes of talking about God's omnipotence here is that God is the final judge. Therefore, no injustice in this life will simply be eternally gotten away with. God will bring all wrongs to right.